Before we begin, I just want to remind you that Somewhere Sinister is back up and running. We're getting through Season 4 and already starting to work on Season 5, so if you like this show, you'll probably like that one, so check it out. A link is in the description. In November of 2009, United States Army personnel were sitting in the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood. They were conducting examinations and finalizing paperwork before they were deployed to combat. These soldiers were heading to Afghanistan, and once there, they fully expected to be in the crosshairs of the enemy. Little did they know the enemy was with them long before they ever left U.S. soil. This is Monsters. Nidal Hasan was born on September 8, 1970, in Arlington, Virginia. His parents had immigrated to the U.S. from Palestine, his father Malik in 1962 and his mother Nora in 1963. A cousin would later say that they had, quote, a typical American upbringing in suburban Virginia, from birthday parties to playing sports to Santa at Christmas. He went on to say that Nidal didn't speak Arabic and he wasn't particularly religious in his youth. When Nidal was 17 years old, his parents opened the Capitol restaurant in the Roanoke City Market. It wasn't well reviewed, but it had a number of regulars who came in to get a beer and a cheap bite to eat. Nidal and his two brothers worked at the family restaurant in various positions throughout their youth. In 1995, the Hassans closed that restaurant and opened the Mount Olive Bar and Grill, which was said to be more upscale. In high school, Nidal was said to have been intelligent and funny. He liked to make jokes and was outgoing. He joined the U.S. Army right out of high school despite his parents' objections. He completed basic training at Fort Benning in Georgia before being stationed at Fort Irwin in California. While there, he took classes on base through Barstow Community College. After completing his first year with straight A's and being placed on the Dean's List, Nidal's active duty status was deferred and he returned to Virginia where he attended Virginia Western Community College full-time. He returned to working at his family's restaurant and received an associate's degree in science in 1992. From there, Nidal enrolled at Virginia Tech and began working on a degree in biochemistry. He got good grades while there, but did have an issue with some lab work he was doing for one of the instructors. Catherine Simon said that he resisted following her instructions and insisted that he knew a better way. It resulted in a number of cultures becoming contaminated, and she brought it to the attention of one of his advisors. From then on, she said that the student was more confrontational, and both her and Nidal's supervisor believed that he had a problem taking instructions from a woman. Once the semester was over, he didn't sign up to help in the lab again. The rest of his college years seemed to be pretty unremarkable. His advisor said he was a good student but didn't socialize at all outside of class. He graduated in 1995 and spent 3 months at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, where he completed medical training. After that, he had some time off in Virginia and he applied for a concealed weapons permit. He passed the background check, but he hadn't completed a required firearms safety course, so he took the personal protection course through the National Rifle Association and was finally issued his permit in April of 1996. 2 years later, Nidal's father had a sudden heart attack and died. After that, Nidal began accompanying his mother to her mosque, and it was there that he met Anwar al-Awlaki, an American-born radical cleric who would go on to become the spiritual advisor to multiple terrorists who were responsible for the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Around that time, Nidal was accepted into the F. Edward Hebert School of Medicine of the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Nidal moved into an apartment in the Washington, D.C. area, but not long after he began his studies, he had to take a hiatus because his mother was diagnosed with cancer. Nora moved into his apartment with him, and on top of caring for her, Nidal became increasingly interested with Islam. He memorized the Quran, began praying 5 times a day, and regularly attended the mosque. Nora died in May of 2001, and the realization that he no longer had either of his parents was huge. He had turned to them for guidance, and outside of joining the military, would usually carry out whatever his parents asked of him. Now he was completely on his own, and he turned to religion to help fulfill the guidance he had lost. Then, only 4 months later, terrorists attacked the US on September 11th, which meant the US government was looking for the people responsible for the plan, and rightly so. That meant the US started sending troops to the Middle East, and Nidal saw it as his country attacking his faith. He loved the US, which was why he had joined the army, but he was also dedicated to his faith, so there was an enormous internal struggle. Nidal graduated from university in 2003 and did his internship and residency at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He ended up specializing in the field of psychiatry. Over the years, he began feeling stronger that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were assaults on his religion. He requested an early release from his military contract as a conscientious objector, but was denied. To be fair, the military had paid him to go through medical school, and they wanted a return on their investment. He did offer to pay the government back for his schooling, but his request was still denied, and to be honest, it was an offer he wouldn't have been able to keep. So Nidal accepted that he would have to stay in the army for the rest of his 7-year contract. Instead of focusing on his medical training, he focused his attention on trying to help Muslims who were fighting against the Americans in the Middle East. From then on, while at Walter Reed, he spoke openly about the evil deeds of the American infidels and proselytized about Islam. He tried to preach to a fellow student, and when she told him she wasn't interested, he told her she would burn for eternity in the afterlife. After that, she avoided him. Since he was training as a psychiatrist, he was assigned to treat soldiers returning from the Middle East who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He preached Islam to the patients and even changed the wording of their charts to say Allah instead of God. He was counseled for, quote, inappropriately discussing religious topics with his assigned patients. Nidal had gone from a top medical student to one who was barely passing. He would show up late or not respond to pages that would leave patients unattended. He didn't show up for his United States medical licensing exam and was put on probation, though he eventually took and passed the test. Despite continually being counseled and put on probation, he continued to advance in the program. It's unclear why someone with so many problems kept getting more chances. Maybe the government didn't want to waste their investment, or maybe they thought he was performing poorly on purpose to try and get kicked out. Either way, he remained in the army and for a while was only seeing 1 patient a week. In March of 2003, Sergeant Hassan Akbar went on a rampage at Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait. He threw grenades into an officer's tent and shot them as they ran outside. 2 officers were killed and 14 others were wounded. Hassan had spent the years after 9/11 becoming radicalized, and he had written in his diary that his biggest goal was to destroy America. He was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to death. But that wasn't the end of his story, because he had inspired Nidal to do even more to save Muslims against the American infidels. In June of 2007, Nidal gave a PowerPoint presentation titled The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the US Military. According to him, it displayed the implications of Muslims fighting America's war against fellow Muslims. Other young doctors in training had given presentations, many of them about medicines or medical conditions, but Nidal wanted to give a lecture about Islam, jihad, and Osama bin Laden. He ended his presentation explaining that Muslim soldiers should be given the option of release from the military as conscientious objectors. That presentation finally raised a red flag with at least one person. One of his advisors took him aside and told him that he didn't think the military was a good fit for him and offered to help him resign. Unfortunately, Nidal wouldn't be able to do that and receive an honorable discharge, so he turned the offer down. When Nidal was finished with his residency, he was accepted into a fellowship in preventative and disaster psychiatry. In that position, he would provide psychiatric services to people who had been in major catastrophes, natural disasters, mass casualty events, and terrorist attacks. It was an ironic fellowship, knowing that he would go on to create a mass casualty event a few years later. His behavior in the fellowship was no different than his residency. When students were tasked with making a presentation in an environmental health class, most students covered things like air quality or ozone, but Nidal made a presentation about the US involvement in the war on Islam. Many students thought it was inappropriate, but the teacher didn't stop him. By that time, Nidal's views were getting so extreme that he was arguing with other people who attended his mosque. It's not uncommon for people of an extremist view based on anything to start viewing the members of that thing as not doing enough. Nidal would regularly argue with others at his mosque to defend the concept of jihad and said that killing someone is justified if they're doing a Muslim wrong. Other churchgoers tried to correct his beliefs, but they said he had become more anti-American than American at that point. At the end of 2008, Nidal began communicating with Anwar al-Awlaki, who had by then fled to Yemen. Nidal's first email was intercepted by the FBI since he mentioned the military, and one agent asked to find out if the sender was in the military, but they didn't get an answer until it was too late. Throughout the beginning of 2009, Nidal sent 16 emails to the former imam of his mosque asking for advice, and he also asked him to present an award for a writing contest that didn't exist. It seemed like a ruse to try and befriend someone he clearly admired. Al-Awlaki responded to Nidal twice, but they were short and informal messages. The FBI had intercepted the messages but didn't seem to put any priority on them, and no evaluation was done for months. Nidal completed the fellowship in preventative and disaster psychiatry and was promoted to major in May of 2009. 2 months later, Nidal was given orders to report to Fort Hood, Texas, which is the largest military base in the country. He arrived in July, and on the 30th, he went to Guns Galore in Killeen, just outside of the base, and asked to see the most technologically advanced weapon on the market that had the highest standard magazine capacity. When he was asked what he was going to use it for, he repeated that he wanted the most advanced weapon with the largest magazine capacity. He was shown an FN-57 semi-automatic pistol, which the store owner owned himself. It used a 20-round magazine standard, but a 10-round magazine was available for jurisdictions with a high-capacity magazine ban, and it also could accept an aftermarket 30-round magazine. Nidal left the store saying he needed to research the weapon, but came back in the next day and purchased the pistol. He also purchased a red and a green laser sight for the weapon. From then on, he returned to the store each week and purchased ammunition and extra magazines. He also began going to a gun range where he practiced shooting the weapon and rapidly exchanging magazines. It was clear that by that time, Nidal believed that his best course of action to protect fellow Muslims was to carry out an attack on his fellow soldiers. At Fort Hood, Nidal had an office in the behavioral health department of the Darnell Medical Center. He also counseled patients at a walk-in psychiatric center located next to the hospital. His new colleagues said that he seemed completely disinterested in his new job, and one of his supervisors, Colonel Kimberly Kessling, talked to him about his performance at Walter Reed. She made sure he knew she expected him to perform his duties in a manner befitting an officer and a healthcare professional. It likely didn't help that this supervisor was a woman, as, like many religions, Muslims don't put a high value on women. They're a lower class and shouldn't be telling a man what to do. It's unknown how his resistance to taking direction from a woman affected his new position, but it was said that he and Colonel Kessling didn't get along at all. For months, Nidal treated patients who had returned from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they told him stories about the things that were happening over there. He would hear stories of not only soldiers, but civilians being killed as well, and it only fueled his hatred of America. For someone who had already become radicalized in his beliefs, it's hard to understand how the military wouldn't recognize that position as being the worst place for Nidal to be. Every patient he saw was like another drip of gasoline on the fire, and Nidal eventually decided that he had to take action. Like with any extremist, his beliefs became so strong that killing innocent people became a logical answer. He twisted the words of his religion to convince himself that what he was about to do was justified. He continued to make his plan for action, but it would end up coming sooner than he originally planned. At the end of October, Nidal began inquiring about having some of the soldiers he counseled prosecuted for war crimes. One soldier had told him that he had found and killed an insurgent, but at the same time he killed the man's wife. Another said that he and his unit poured 50 gallons of fuel into the Iraqi water supply as revenge. Nidal emailed one of his commanders, but was seen as more of a nuisance, so on the next rotation of troops into Afghanistan, Nidal was assigned to the 467th Medical Detachment and given orders to deploy. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Phillips then wrote a glowing review of Nidal to ensure his new commanding officer would accept him for deployment. He claimed that Nidal was a superb addition to their team and that he had a strong work ethic, professionalism, and sound judgment. All lies. And it needs to be pointed out that that action could have put other soldiers' lives at risk. Lying about a soldier's performance right before their deployment just because you want to get rid of them is extremely irresponsible. The other soldiers would be depending on that person for their lives, and not knowing that he had issues could have potentially put the rest of the unit at risk. It was a very unprofessional and hazardous thing to do. That said, Nidal would go on to do worse. Nidal began a week-long pre-deployment leave on November 2, 2009. He told co-workers that he was going to Virginia to visit family, but he never left Fort Hood or nearby Killeen. On the 3rd, he went to the shooting range and then emptied out a safe deposit box he held at a local Bank of America. On the 4th, Nidal cleared out his apartment, giving food and clothes to neighbors. He gave copies of the Quran to neighbors and shredded a bunch of paperwork. Neighbors said they saw him take multiple bags of garbage to the dumpster. On the 5th, Nidal went to the mosque for morning prayer, where he grabbed the mic and made a speech before saying goodbye to the congregants. Afterward, he stopped at his apartment and changed into his military uniform. Nidal first went to the Darnell Medical Center and went directly to Lieutenant Colonel Phillips's office, but he wasn't there. Nidal asked a clerk where he was, and she told him that the lieutenant colonel was on vacation and wouldn't be back until the following week. Nidal moved around the building, going to the basement before returning to the 5th floor and asking the clerk if she was sure Lieutenant Colonel Phillips wasn't going to be back that day. She was sure. Then Nidal called his superior and left a message to call back. While awaiting a return call, Nidal sat in his office and read an article online about jihad that quoted a Taliban leader encouraging followers not to be cowards. When the lieutenant colonel called, Nidal demanded to know where he was, but was disappointed to find out that he was in Arizona. Nidal asked about his performance review, and after a brief chat he hung up, but was clearly frustrated. Was it part of Nidal's plan to kill Lieutenant Colonel Ben Phillips and then go on a shooting rampage at his own place of employment? It's unknown, as the subject was never broached at his trial. The prosecution's position was that the attack was premeditated, which seems to be true, but he stated in court that Nidal had planned out even the smallest of details. In reality, that might not have been the case. From reading about Nidal's movements that day, it seemed like he wanted to take action at his office, not knowing that Lieutenant Colonel Phillips was on vacation. Once he realized that his plan wasn't going to work, he spent the next few hours thinking about what to do and ended up attacking the Readiness Center. The Soldier Readiness Processing Center was where soldiers who were pending deployment would be assessed for their readiness in the field. There are a number of exams and assessments that take place at the center, both medical and administrative. Nidal drove to the mosque to attend noon prayers, and when he returned to his office, he tucked the FN-57 in his waistband and then put a .357 handgun in the front pocket of his uniform blouse. He then wrapped at least 20 magazines and paper towels to keep them from clanking together and placed them in another blouse pocket. After driving to the Readiness Center, he exited his vehicle and put earplugs in. As he walked from his car to the building, he held his phone to his ear and pretended to be having a conversation so he wouldn't be interrupted on his way. At 1:25 p.m., Nidal Hasan approached Latoya Williams, a civilian worker at one of the stations inside the center, and told her that the officer in charge there, Major Parrish, had had an emergency and needed her. Latoya didn't recognize the man, but saw on his uniform that he was a major, so she took his claim as true. When she left the station to go to Major Parrish's office, Nidal stood behind the counter, said a prayer, and then shouted, quote, "Allahu Akbar." Then he pulled the FN-57 from his waistband and started firing. Nidal sprayed the most populated area of the building with bullets first before taking aim at individuals. In the initial spray of bullets, 44-year-old specialist Paul Martin was hit in the arm and in the back before managing to run out of the building. 21-year-old Dana Ferguson was struck in the arm as she fled and she fell to the ground. Nidal shot her at least 2 more times, once in the leg and once in the shoulder, before she lost consciousness. The next thing she would remember would be waking up in the hospital. Army Reserve Captain John Gaffney was the first to charge Nidal, but he was shot and killed before reaching him. Staff Sergeant Michael Davis had just walked into the Readiness Center when he was hit and fell to the ground and played dead. Once Nidal had left the building, Sergeant Davis ran out of the other side of the center and flagged down a man in a truck who drove him to the hospital. Retired Chief Warrant Officer Michael Cahill was working at the center as a civilian physician's assistant when he also rushed at Nidal with a chair, but was also shot and killed. Being trained to fight, there was no shortage of people at the Readiness Center who risked their own lives to try and stop the terrorist. Sergeant Alonzo Lunsford watched as Michael Cahill was shot dead and immediately jumped up to make his own attempt to stop the shooter. He was shot in the head, and after collapsing, he began crawling out of the building. As he did, he was hit 4 more times in the back, abdomen, and upper chest before making it outside. He would miraculously survive his injuries. Specialist Logan Barnett initially thought it was a drill until he saw his friend Staff Sergeant Sean Manning get shot 6 times in the torso. When Nidal stopped to reload, Specialist Barnett picked up a folding table but was shot before he had a chance to throw it. He was able to take cover behind a cubicle and managed to survive his injuries. Private First Class Lance Aviles was chatting with his friend Specialist Cam Zhang when the shooting started. PFC Aviles and Specialist Zhang dove to the floor, but after a few minutes it became clear that Zhang had been hit and killed. Nearby, Sergeant Michael Carroll was sitting with his friend Private First Class Aaron Nemelka when they were sprayed with bullets. Sergeant Carroll was hit 4 times and managed to survive, but PFC Nemelka was killed. Private First Class Michael Pearson was nearby and also fatally shot. Specialist Frederick Green saw his friend get gunned down and charged Nidal, but was shot 12 times and fell to the floor. He would end up dying from his wounds. As Nidal moved to the back of the building, other soldiers and staff were coming out of hiding to start assisting the wounded. One of the wounded was Lieutenant Colonel Juanita Warman, who was still conscious when she was found, but after saying, quote, "I'm not gonna make it. I'm gonna die," she succumbed to her wounds. As Nidal exited the Readiness Center, Police Officer Kimberly Munley was on the scene and she exchanged gunshots with the extremist. Neither were hit and Nidal ran behind another building. Officer Munley ran around the other side of the building trying to cut him off, and as she turned the corner she was hit twice, once in the hand and once in the knee. She tried to return fire but her weapon malfunctioned. Nidal approached the officer and kicked her weapon away, but didn't kill her. It was later noted that he only seemed interested in killing military personnel and had the opportunity to shoot civilians multiple times but didn't. He believed his war was with the US military and that's who he was targeting. Major Stephen Richter was nearby when he heard gunshots and took cover behind a van. He called his supervisor and alerted him to the situation before advancing on the shooter. He watched as Nidal walked over to Officer Munley and kicked her gun away, then took cover behind a telephone pole. Another police officer on the scene, Mark Todd, yelled at Nidal to drop his weapon, but the gunman fired at him, so Officer Todd returned fire, hitting Nidal multiple times. When Nidal's gun was empty, Major Richter ran to him and grabbed the weapon, burning his hand in the process. As Officer Todd approached and kicked the gun away, the Major had stuck his finger into one of Nidal's wounds, slowing the bleeding. It was likely his instinct as a trained military officer to attempt to save life, but also, many people wouldn't have wanted him to die right there without answering for the horror he had carried out. As Nidal Hasan was being transported to the hospital, the level of carnage at the scene was finally able to come into full view. 13 people had been killed and 32 had been wounded. The dead were 62-year-old retired Chief Warrant Officer Michael Cahill, 56-year-old Captain John Gaffney, 55-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Juanita Warman, 52-year-old Major Libardo Caravio, 51-year-old Captain Russell Seeger, 32-year-old Staff Sergeant Justin DeCrow, 29-year-old Specialist Frederick Green, 29-year-old Staff Sergeant Amy Kruger, 23-year-old Private First Class Cam Zhang, 22-year-old Specialist Jason Hunt, 22-year-old Private First Class Michael Pearson, 21-year-old Private First Class Francesca Velez, who was 3 months pregnant, and 19-year-old Private First Class Thomas Nemelka. The 32 wounded were treated at the hospital for a wide variety of wounds, from grazes to being shot in the head. Some would wind up with permanent disabilities. One of the wounded, Chief Warrant Officer Christopher Royal, started a non-profit foundation called 32 Still Standing to raise money for the survivors. Investigators found 146 spent shell casings inside the building and another 68 casings outside. There were a total of 214 rounds fired by Nidal and the responding officers, though the majority were from the attacker. When Nidal was taken into custody, he still had 177 rounds of ammunition on him and 20 and 30-round magazines in his pocket. He also had the second handgun, which he had never used. Nidal was transported to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, where he was listed in critical condition. One of the bullets that struck him had paralyzed him from the waist down, and he was in a coma. After the shooting, analysts studied every aspect of the attack, and questions were asked about how no red flags were raised about Nidal's behavior in the years leading up to the shooting. Not only did he openly talk about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan being wrong, he went to extremes, claiming that non-Muslims should be beheaded and have boiling water poured down their throats. It's said that people around him were alarmed by those claims, but not enough to think he should possibly not be in the position that he was. It seems like something that should have caused immediate action to be taken. And on top of that, as others pointed out, he worked with psychiatrists. None of those people who were supposedly experts in mental health seemed to think that Nidal's behavior was on the level of taking direct action. It seems strange. A Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs report said that they believed the military had not paid proper attention to Nidal Hasan's radicalization and ignored the signs that he was becoming more and more critical of wars that he considered the U.S. to be waging against Islam. That Nidal had attempted to leave the military and at least one of his advisors offered to help him. Also that Nidal had made several presentations to his classmates and professors that clearly demonstrated his radical views. On top of that, the FBI was aware that Nidal was communicating with a radical overseas and still nothing was done to stop him before he went on a killing spree. Their hope was to look into the flaws that were identified and ensure a soldier who was becoming radicalized didn't slip through the cracks again. Many Muslims condemned what Nidal had done, but not Anwar al-Awlaki. On his website, he labeled Nidal a hero and praised him as a quote-unquote man of conscience who could not support wars against fellow Muslims. Right, a man of conscience who was able to gun down anyone in a uniform despite knowing nothing about them. His actions showed that he had no conscience and indiscriminately killed anyone based on his own flawed beliefs. Nidal's motives were also highly debated, and they really wouldn't be cleared up since he never made it clear on his own. Reasons for his attack included his frustration that his superiors weren't taking his demands of prosecuting some of his patients as war criminals seriously, and obviously his upcoming deployment. During his trial, all Nidal would say was that his motive was to protect Taliban leaders in Afghanistan, but his actions would ultimately have no effect on the people he was supposedly protecting. His actions were self-serving, and because he wasn't getting his way, he took it out on innocent people. Nidal's brother had hired retired Colonel John Galligan to represent him, and as soon as he was hired, he began telling the media his client's mental health was in question. Of course. Nidal's brother Anis had been a lawyer in the U.S. before moving back to Palestine, and John Galligan brought him to Texas and made him part of Nidal's legal team. While Nidal was recovering in the hospital, the Bell County Jail was making special preparations to house him during his trial. Due to his permanent paralysis, he would never be able to walk and would require special equipment in his cell. He was transferred from the hospital to the jail on April 9, 2010. Nidal was on 24-hour watch when he first arrived at the jail. A deputy sat at a desk and watched him through a window, making reports every 15 minutes. That was eventually lowered to a 12-hour watch. Nidal was evaluated and deemed sane in January of 2011. Mike Mulligan was the prosecutor, and he had successfully prosecuted the case against Hassan Akbar, and the cases seemed to parallel each other. With the determination that Nidal was sane, the prosecutor announced that he would be seeking the death penalty. Military regulations do not allow the defendant to plead guilty in a capital case, so despite Nidal announcing he wanted to plead guilty, he was not allowed. In 2012, Nidal changed lawyers and was given time for his new counsel to prepare. After more delays, in June of 2013, Nidal was given approval to represent himself, and the trial date was set for August 6th of that year. In Nidal's opening statement, he said, quote, "The evidence will clearly show that I am the shooter. The evidence will also show that I was on the wrong side. I then switched sides." Nidal didn't seem to have any interest in being found not guilty. I would have been surprised if he tried to use insanity as a defense if he could, since that would mean that what he did was wrong. Nidal didn't believe that what he did was wrong. He was proud of it and he wanted the world to know. He decided to defend himself because that would give him the opportunity to show the world that he knowingly and willingly chose to fight against the US military. He was going to be found guilty and be executed for his actions, and that would make him a martyr. The prosecution didn't cut any corners because of that. They presented the evidence and called 12 witnesses the first day, proving beyond any doubt that Nidal had committed 13 murders and dozens of attempted murders on November 5, 2009. Nidal only cross-examined 2 witnesses. The first was his previous supervisor, by then retired Lieutenant Colonel Ben Phillips. The defendant questioned the glowing review he had given Nidal in order for him to be deployed, and also asked about the emails he had sent about prosecuting patients for war crimes. None of the information seemed to prove or disprove Nidal's guilt. He also questioned a man named Pat Santi, who was a fellow worshipper at the mosque in Killeen. Pat had testified about Nidal taking the mic at the mosque the day of the shooting and saying goodbye. The purpose of the cross-examination was not clear. The following day, Nidal's backup defense approached the judge with concerns that the defendant was ensuring that he would be sentenced to the death penalty. They filed a motion to be put back in control of Nidal's defense, but the judge denied it and the trial continued. The prosecutor called 15 survivors of the attack to the stand, where they recounted the events of that day, described the wounds they had received and the permanent damage that some of them had. Sergeant First Class Maria Guerrera told how she had listened to PFC Francesca Velez begging for her baby's life. Quote, please don't, my baby, my baby." Then Nidal executed her. When it came time for the defense to present a case, well, he didn't. He didn't take the stand or call any witnesses. After the prosecution made his closing argument, Nidal declined to make one himself. He had effectively guaranteed himself a guilty verdict and a death sentence, and that's what he got. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all counts. 5 days later, the sentencing phase began, and 19 survivors and family members of the fallen took the stand. The survivors described their wounds. Retired Staff Sergeant Patrick Ziegler underwent 10 surgeries to repair his damaged skull and was not expected to survive. He managed to pull through, though he's paralyzed on his left side. Private First Class Mick Engnell was shot in the neck and lost 85% of the movement in his right arm, making it unlikely that he will ever be able to return to work as a mechanic. Family members described the loss of loved ones like having part of themselves ripped out. Some turned to alcohol, some wanted to end their own lives. The amount of lives destroyed by Nidal's actions weren't limited to just the 13 dead and the 32 injured. They rippled out across the world and affected countless others. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended that Nidal Hasan be sentenced to death. Now, it's unlikely that he will actually get the lethal injection. He became the 6th person on death row at Fort Leavenworth at the time. He will have to go through a lengthy appeals process, and the injuries he sustained during his attack don't give him a prognosis of a long life. The last person executed after a military court-martial was in 1961, and though he doesn't deserve to live, he also doesn't deserve to become a martyr. Nidal Hasan, your actions were evil and selfish, and you nor anyone else will ever convince me that your God wanted you to carry them out. The only thing that's guaranteed if your religion is true is that you'll be burning in hell with the rest of the monsters like you. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.